Obituaries are fascinating because they tell us not only about the person who died, but also about what we as a society value in other people. And often what we value in other people is exactly what kills them in the first place. You heard the expression, the good die young? They do. And there's reasons for it. A lot of you are heaving a sigh of relief. Okay, I don't have to worry about myself then, you're saying so. But listen to these obituaries. This one is a doctor who died age 55. And I'm talking here about people who died before their time. This guy dies at age 55 in Toronto of cancer. The obituary says, and this is written as if it was a good thing, never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Toronto's Sick Children's Hospital. He carried on with his duties throughout his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. Now, think about that one. If you're diagnosed with cancer, or if a friend of yours was diagnosed with cancer, would you say to him and her, hey buddy, here's what you do. Go back to work tomorrow. And all the time that you're getting chemotherapy and radiation and whatever else you're going through, just work every day until you die. So this compulsive and rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the needs of the self is a major risk factor for illness. The next obituary is written by a husband about his wife, Naomi, who died at age 55 also of cancer. And he writes, in her entire life, she never got into a fight with anyone. The worst she could say was phooey or something else along those lines. She had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. Now, the suppression of, in other words, she never got angry with anybody. The suppression, the repression of healthy anger is a major risk factor for illness. It actually suppresses the immune system for reasons that I will tell you later. So there's basically 3 ways of dealing with anger. One is to repress it, like this woman did. So these are the people that are always nice. You know, they're always nice. I worry about really nice people. The other way is to give in to it and to act it out, to go into rages. That's also unhealthy. The first, the repression of anger, leads to autoimmune disease and cancer. When you're raging all the time, that increases your risk of heart disease and strokes. So in the aftermath, the studies have shown that in the aftermath of a rage episode, your risk of a heart attack doubles for the next 2 hours. Then there's the healthy expression of anger, or the healthy processing of anger, which most of us don't know how to do. We either do the one or we do the other. I'll talk to you about healthy anger later. But how do we deal with anger has a crucial effect on our health. And this guy writes, you know, she had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. And this is supposed to be a good thing. There was a study just 4 or 5 years ago presented at a major medical conference. They looked at 1,700 women over a 10-year period. And over a 10-year period, out of these women, those who were unhappily married and suppressed their feelings were 4 times as likely to die as those who were also unhappily married but expressed their feelings. So the issue wasn't happy marriage or unhappy marriage. The issue was, did the woman express herself or did she not? I'll read you a couple more of these obituaries. This is a mother in Calgary who died in her early 50s, again, cancer. Just look at this. A master at multitasking, she juggled several hockey practices, school board, orchestra, and other extracurricular activities. June 2005 brought terrible news to this mother of 3 by now president of the Parents' Council at Western Canada College. Emergency surgery revealed metastatic cancer. She refused the cloak of illness. She did not give up on any of her roles. You know, she had all these roles, and they were more important than who she was. She even continued her 5 a.m. bicycle trips around the nearby reservoir. Now imagine that when you're getting chemotherapy. She enrolled in a life coaching course, and upon graduation from the Adler School, she initiated Living Out Loud, a group for women with cancer. That's very typical of people who get chronic disease. And finally, another physician who dies of cancer, and again how the obituary writes something that's clearly, when we look at it, is self-destructive, but the person didn't realize it, and neither does the individual who writes the obituary. Sidney and his mother had an incredibly special relationship, a bond that was apparent in all aspects of their lives until her death. As a married man with young children, Sidney made a point to have dinner with his parents every day, as his wife Rosalind and their 4 kids waited for him at home. Sidney would walk in, greeted by yet another dinner to eat and to enjoy. Never wanting to disappoint either woman in his life, Sidney kept eating 2 dinners a day for years until gradual weight gain began to raise suspicions. Okay? So that this poor man suffered under the belief that, number one, he was responsible how everybody else felt, and number 2, he must never disappoint anybody. So he actually couldn't say to his mother, you know, Mom, I got amazing news. I got 4 kids. And I'm going to have dinner with them most of the time. Nor could he say to his wife, you know, Rosalind, I'm very close with my mom. She needs my support. So once or twice a week, I'm going to have dinner with her. He just tried to please everybody all the time. And this need to please everybody all the time, it'll kill you. And for reasons I will tell you. And these reasons are not psychological. They're physiological. They have to do with the body, the immune system, and everything else. You can't separate the mind from the body. And the problem with my profession, the medical profession, is that we make 2 separations that are actually, in life, impossible to make. One is that we separate the mind from the body. We think that people's emotional lives are somehow separate from their physiology. Completely false assumption, unscientific, refuted by all the research, and yet if you go to a doctor, I mean, I know some of you here have had autoimmune illnesses, for example. So ask yourself, when you've been to the physician with your rheumatoid arthritis, your joint being inflamed, or some other rheumatic condition, did anybody ever ask you about your childhood? Anybody ever ask you about your stresses in your life? Anybody ever ask you about your marriage? About how you relate to your work? About how you look after yourself or how you don't? Likely not. Likely what they did is they said, you got this illness, we don't know why you got it, and here are the pills. So they'll give you a medication to suppress the inflammation, or they'll give you a medication because autoimmune disease, the immune system attacks the body itself, so we give you a medication to suppress the immune system itself. Or we'll give you cortisol or some kind of other steroid. Well, that's all we do. We don't talk about the life factors that may have contributed to the onset of the illness. And you're going to wonder, why didn't anybody say this to me before? Because in the West, when I say the West, I mean the dominant Western culture, unlike Aboriginal cultures, unlike the traditional medicines of China or India or native traditions around the world, we separate the mind from the body. So we treat only the body, unless you have mental illness, in which case we still separate the mind from the body. And the other thing we separate is the individual from the environment. As I said to you last night, those of you that were there, you can't separate people from their environment. People are shaped by the environment. And in lifelong, in interaction with the environment is how human beings live. It's been shown now, for example, that children whose parents are stressed are much more likely to have asthma. Now, not controversial. Several studies have shown that. So in polluted areas where there is more asthma, it's the kids of parents who are stressed who are most likely to have the asthma. Now, Most doctors have never heard about that. And if they did, they can't explain it. And yet it's so obvious, you see.